Lucas Hunt was tired but satisfied as he drove home after another long day managing his solar panel installation business. The evening air was cool, and he looked forward to parking his truck in the driveway and spending some quiet time with his 14-year-old daughter, Emma. As he turned onto his street, however, his chest tightened in confusion. Two massive dumpsters had been placed directly in front of his driveway, completely blocking access to his home. The dumpsters were filthy, their rusted exteriors covered in streaks of dried mud and paint. A pungent chemical smell wafted from them, faint but sharp enough to sting Lucas's nose even from inside his truck. His first instinct was that this was some sort of mistake, a construction project gone wrong, a delivery meant for another address. But as he got out of the truck to investigate, he spotted a large sign bolted to the side of one of the dumpsters. It read, in bold red letters, pay outstanding balance $2,800. Contact Residence Association for removal. Lucas frowned, the words hitting him like a slap. Outstanding balance? What balance? He knew for a fact that he didn't owe anything to the Neighborhood Residents Association. He had paid all his dues on time and had even gone out of his way to avoid conflict with them after a minor dispute over his solar panels a year earlier. This had to be a misunderstanding. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone and dialed the number listed on the sign. Residents Association office answered a curt, almost robotic voice. This is Lucas Hunt, from 1372 Oakwood. There are dumpsters blocking my driveway. I don't understand what this is about. I don't owe any money, this has to be a mistake, Lucas said firmly. The voice on the other end paused, then sighed in a way that sent Lucas's blood boiling. Oh, Mr. Hunt, the voice finally said, dripping with condescension, you'll need to take that up with our president, Michael Pearson. He authorized the placement of the dumpsters. Put him on the phone, then Lucas demanded. He's unavailable right now, but I'll let him know you called, the woman replied in a clipped tone before abruptly hanging up. Frustrated but determined, Lucas climbed back into his truck and parked it down the street, walking the rest of the way to his house. Emma greeted him at the door, her expression concerned. What's going on, Dad? I saw the dumpsters from the window. Are they doing construction? No, Lucas said grimly. Apparently it's some kind of punishment from the association. They're claiming I owe money, but I don't. Emma's face twisted in confusion. But you pay everything on time. Why would they do that? That's what I'm going to find out, Lucas muttered, already pulling up his email on his phone to review any recent correspondence from the Residents Association. After combing through every message, he found nothing indicating a balance or a pending issue. If anything, the last email had been a generic reminder about the annual meeting he hadn't been able to attend because of work. The smell from the dumpsters seeped into the house as the evening wore on, becoming almost unbearable. Lucas taped the windows shut and turned on an air purifier, but the odor seemed to cling to everything. By the time they sat down for dinner, his irritation had turned into a slow burn of anger. He wasn't about to let anyone bully him on his own property. The next morning, Lucas decided to confront Michael Pearson directly. He drove to the association's office, a small building tucked into a strip mall 5 miles away. As he walked in, the receptionist barely glanced up from her computer. Name, she asked flatly. Lucas Hunt. I need to speak to Michael Pearson. She raised an eyebrow. Do you have an appointment? No, but it's urgent, Lucas replied, trying to keep his tone even. The receptionist pursed her lips but picked up the phone, murmured something, then hung up. Mr. Pearson will see you in 5 minutes. Please wait. Lucas paced the small waiting area, his jaw clenched. Finally, the door to the back office creaked open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man in an expensive suit stepped out. Michael Pearson radiated the kind of smug confidence that made Lucas's stomach churn. Mr. Hunt, Pearson said with a tight smile. What can I do for you? You can explain why there are dumpsters blocking my driveway and why your office claims I owe $2,800 when I've paid every single bill on time, Lucas said sharply. Pearson chuckled, as if Lucas had just told a mildly amusing joke. Ah, yes, the matter of the dumpsters. You see, Mr. Hunt, there have been issues flagged with your property. Unapproved landscaping, maintenance violations, and of course the unpaid fees. That's absurd, Lucas shot back. I've received no notifications about any of this, and I certainly don't owe $2,800. Pearson leaned against the edge of his desk, his smirk widening. Well, Mr. Hunt, the board reviewed your account and found multiple discrepancies. It's all in the bylaws, which you agreed to when you moved in. If you'd like the dumpsters removed, you'll need to pay the outstanding balance. Otherwise, they stay right where they are. Lucas stared at him, incredulous. This is extortion. Pearson shrugged. Call it what you want. But if you want access to your driveway, you know what to do. Fuming, Lucas stormed out of the office, his fists clenched. As he drove home, he couldn't help but feel the full weight of the situation settling on his chest. This wasn't just about money or inconvenience, this was about control. And he wasn't about to let Michael Pearson win. Lucas spent the entire drive home replaying the conversation with Michael Pearson in his head, each smug word echoing like a taunt. It wasn't just the unfairness of the situation that ate at him, it was the way Pearson had delivered it, as though Lucas were just another pawn to be moved around at his whim. The dumpsters were more than an inconvenience, they were a deliberate show of power, an attempt to force submission. But Lucas wasn't the type to back down. By the time he pulled into the street leading to his house, Lucas had already begun planning his next move. He parked his truck farther down the road again, unable to use his own driveway, and walked toward his home. The dumpsters loomed like ugly monuments, their chemical stench stronger than the day before. Lucas noticed something new. Flies swarmed around one of the lids, and a dark, sticky liquid had begun seeping from the bottom, staining the asphalt. A neighbor, an older man named George, was standing at the edge of his yard, looking at the scene with thinly veiled concern. "Morning," Lucas, George said cautiously as Lucas approached. "You okay? That mess looks pretty bad." Lucas stopped and exhaled deeply. "Not really, George. Pearson's claiming I owe money I don't, and now he's using these things to try to strong-arm me. Have you ever seen anything like this?" George hesitated, glancing around as if someone might overhear. "Not exactly like this," he said finally, lowering his voice. "But Pearson's been pulling stunts like this for a while. Janet over on Willow Street, she got fined for unauthorized fencing, even though her fence had been there for years. And the Parkers? They had to sell after a pile of violations mysteriously showed up all at once. Pearson's got his fingers in everything around here. Most folks just pay up to avoid the trouble." Lucas frowned. "Why doesn't anyone fight back?" George gave a grim chuckle. "Who's got the time or money for that? Pearson's got the association's lawyers on his side, and he's not afraid to use them. You're the first person I've seen stand up to him, Lucas. But be careful. He doesn't like it when people push back." The warning hung in the air as Lucas thanked George and walked inside. Emma was at the dining table, her homework spread out in front of her, but she looked up as he entered. "Any luck with that guy?" she asked. Lucas shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "No, he's doubling down. Claims I owe money, but he couldn't even back it up with proper evidence. This is about control, not debt." Emma frowned. "So what are you going to do?" Lucas set his keys on the counter and leaned against the wall, thinking, "First, I'm going to document everything. Pictures, videos, everything I can to prove what they're doing. Then I'm calling Rebecca." Rebecca Miller was a lawyer Lucas had worked with on a business dispute years ago. She was sharp, thorough, and didn't back down from a fight, exactly the kind of person Lucas needed on his side. He grabbed his phone and dialed her number, pacing the kitchen as it rang. Rebecca Miller, a familiar voice, answered. "Rebecca, it's Lucas Hunt," he said, relief flooding his tone. "I need your help. I'm dealing with something serious. My residents association has blocked my driveway with dumpsters, claiming I owe them money I don't. It's escalating fast, and I'm not sure what to do next." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Rebecca's voice turned serious. "That's outrageous. Okay, here's what I need from you. Document everything. Photos, videos, correspondence, any letters or notices they've sent you. I'll need a full picture of what's happening. Send me what you've got, and I'll take a closer look." I've already started documenting, Lucas said. But I'll gather everything tonight and send it over. What do you think my chances are? Rebecca hesitated. It depends on what we can prove. If they've overstepped their authority or broken any laws, we'll have a strong case. But associations like this often operate in legal gray areas. They count on homeowners being too overwhelmed to fight back. Are you ready for this to get messy? Lucas didn't even have to think. I don't have a choice. They're trying to intimidate me, and I won't let them. Good, Rebecca said firmly. Send me what you have, and we'll take it from there. After hanging up, Lucas spent the next few hours gathering evidence. He photographed the dumpsters from every angle, capturing the signs, the leaking liquid, and the swarms of flies. He recorded a video of himself walking through the area, narrating the situation in detail. Then he dug through his email, bank statements, and payment receipts to prove he was up to date on all his dues. As he worked, the smell from the dumpsters seemed to grow stronger, seeping into the house despite the sealed windows. Emma complained of a headache and retreated to her room, leaving Lucas alone in his frustration. He stepped outside to get some fresh air, but as he approached the dumpsters, something caught his eye. The lid of one of the containers was slightly ajar. Lucas frowned and moved closer. The smell was overwhelming now, a nauseating mix of chemicals and decay. He hesitated, then grabbed a stick from the yard and used it to nudge the lid open. Inside was a tangled heap of construction debris, broken wood, drywall, and bags of unidentified waste. But what stood out was a cluster of metal drums at the bottom, each marked with a bright yellow label, reading hazardous materials, handle with care. Lucas stepped back, his stomach twisting. Hazardous materials? Were they seriously dumping toxic waste in front of his house? This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore, it was a health hazard. He pulled out his phone and snapped several pictures of the labels before closing the lid. The next morning, Lucas sent everything to Rebecca, including the pictures of the hazardous materials. When she called him back, her tone was sharper than before. Lucas, this just got a lot more serious. If those materials are what I think they are, the association might be violating environmental laws. I'm reaching out to a contact in environmental health. In the meantime, don't touch the dumpsters or try to move them yourself. Let the professionals handle it. Lucas nodded, though he doubted she could see him. What should I do if they escalate? Keep documenting, Rebecca said, and keep your cool. If they think they can provoke you into doing something rash, they'll use it against you. Stay calm and let me handle the legal side. Her words were reassuring, but as Lucas hung up, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get worse. Sure enough, by the time he returned home that evening, the situation had escalated. The dumpsters hadn't been removed. Instead, more debris had been added, and the liquid leaking from the bottom had spread across the driveway, leaving dark stains on the pavement. Worse still, someone had spray-painted the words "Pay Up" or "Get Out" in bright red letters on the side of one of the dumpsters. The message was clear. This was personal. Lucas clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he stared at the vandalized dumpster. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was a battle for control, and he wasn't going to let them win. Lucas woke up early the next morning, his mind racing as he prepared for what was becoming a war of attrition. The sight of the vandalized dumpsters still burned in his memory. The words "Pay Up" or "Get Out" weren't just graffiti, they were a threat, a clear indication that the Residents Association, or at least someone acting on its behalf, was escalating. Lucas wasn't sure whether it was Michael Pearson directly behind it or some overzealous supporter trying to make a point, but it didn't matter. This was his property, his home, and he wasn't about to back down. He started his day by setting up 2 more security cameras, strategically placing them to capture the dumpsters and anyone who came near them. If the association wanted to keep up this harassment, they would have to do it on record. Lucas also called a local cleaning service, hoping to at least get the toxic liquid cleaned up before it caused permanent damage to his driveway. When the cleaning crew arrived, they didn't get far. The foreman, a no-nonsense woman named Carla, took one look at the leaking liquid and shook her head. "I can't touch this," she said, pointing to the dark stains. "This isn't just water or oil, this looks like chemical runoff." You'll need a hazmat team for this, and that's going to cost you." Lucas cursed under his breath. He'd already spent the past few days dealing with mounting costs, and now the association's tactics were starting to hit him financially. He thanked Carla for her time and promised to call back once he figured out his next steps. After the crew left, Lucas decided to inspect the area himself. The liquid had spread farther overnight, creeping onto his lawn and threatening the edge of his flower beds. He put on gloves and carefully collected a small sample in a jar, intending to have it analyzed. If this really was hazardous waste, it would be the leverage he needed to turn the tables on Michael Pearson and his cronies. Later that day, Lucas sat in his kitchen, scrolling through emails on his laptop. He had sent Rebecca the new footage from his security cameras, which showed more trash being dumped into the dumpsters late at night. The grainy footage captured two figures in dark clothing, faces obscured by hoodies, unloading what appeared to be construction debris. Lucas had hoped for a clearer view, but it was enough to prove the association or someone working under its cover was behind the mess. Rebecca called just as Lucas was preparing lunch. "I reviewed the footage," she said without preamble, her voice sharp. "It's good evidence, but we need more. If we can link those individuals to Pearson or the association directly, we'll have a case for harassment and possibly environmental violations. Did you collect anything else?" "I took a sample of the liquid," Lucas replied. "I think it's leaking from the dumpsters. A cleaning crew wouldn't touch it, said it might be chemical runoff." "That's exactly what I needed to hear," Rebecca said, her tone lifting slightly. "I'm going to arrange for testing. If it turns out to be hazardous waste, the association could be in serious trouble." Lucas nodded, the faintest glimmer of hope breaking through his frustration. "What about the graffiti? Can we use that against them?" "It's helpful, but without direct evidence linking it to someone on the board, it'll be hard to prove it was an official action. Still, it adds to the pattern of harassment. Just keep documenting everything, Lucas. We're starting to build momentum." After the call, Lucas took a deep breath and stepped outside, letting the crisp morning air cool his frustration. His relief was short-lived, however. As he walked toward the driveway, he noticed something new: a pile of broken wood and drywall scattered across his front lawn. It looked like someone had deliberately dumped it there overnight. Lucas's blood boiled as he grabbed his phone and started recording. He panned across the mess, narrating every detail for the record. "More trash dumped on my property," he said, his voice tight with anger. "This isn't just about the dumpsters anymore. They're targeting my entire yard now. Whoever's doing this isn't going to stop until they're held accountable." Emma peeked her head out the front door, concern etched on her face. "Dad, what's going on?" "Nothing you need to worry about," Lucas said, forcing a calm tone. "Go back inside, okay? I'll handle this." Emma hesitated but eventually nodded, retreating back into the house. Lucas clenched his jaw, his frustration mounting. He knew he had to keep Emma safe, but it was becoming harder to shield her from the chaos unfolding around them. That evening, Lucas reviewed the footage from his newly installed cameras. This time, the culprits were clearer: two individuals in unmarked work uniforms, driving a beat-up truck with no license plates. They worked quickly, dumping debris and leaving within minutes. Lucas froze the frame, studying their movements. One of them carried something small and metallic, a tool? A container? He couldn't tell, but it felt deliberate, methodical, almost professional. He forwarded the footage to Rebecca immediately. "This is big," she replied within minutes. "If we can identify that truck or those uniforms, we'll be able to tie this back to someone. I'll contact a private investigator to dig into it." The next morning, Lucas woke to find yet another escalation. His mailbox had been ripped off its post and thrown into the street, and his truck's tires had been slashed. The message was clear: whoever was behind this wanted him to feel isolated, powerless. But instead of breaking, Lucas felt his resolve harden. He called the police to report the vandalism, but the officer who arrived seemed disinterested. "Not much we can do without witnesses," the officer said with a shrug. "You should consider upgrading your security system." Lucas bit back a sarcastic reply and thanked the officer before returning to his house. He couldn't rely on the police, not when the association seemed to have everyone under its thumb. If he wanted justice, he'd have to keep fighting on his own terms. By the end of the day, Rebecca had good news. The private investigator had identified the truck from the footage. It was registered to a contractor frequently hired by the Residents Association. That connection was the missing piece they needed to tie the illegal dumping directly to Michael Pearson's leadership. Lucas felt a surge of vindication as Rebecca explained their next steps. They would file an official complaint with the city, citing environmental violations and harassment. The evidence was stacking up, and Pearson would have to answer for his actions. But even as Lucas celebrated this small victory, he knew the fight wasn't over. That night, as he reviewed the day's footage, he noticed something chilling. A figure stood at the edge of his yard, watching his house from the shadows. When Lucas rewound the footage, the figure was gone. The message was clear: Pearson wasn't finished with him yet. Lucas woke up the next morning to a strange sound outside his house, a low, mechanical rumble that he couldn't immediately identify. He threw on a jacket and stepped out onto the porch, scanning the street. A truck had pulled up near the dumpsters, its bed loaded with fresh debris. Two men in work uniforms were tossing pieces of broken drywall, old bricks, and rusted metal into the already overflowing containers. "Hey," Lucas shouted, striding down his driveway. "What do you think you're doing?" The men froze, exchanging a glance before one of them stepped forward. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and looked like he wasn't used to being questioned. "We're just doing our job," the man said, his voice gruff. "Your job?" Lucas snapped. "Dumping more trash in front of my house? These dumpsters aren't supposed to be here in the first place, and now you're making it worse." The man shrugged, clearly uninterested in Lucas's indignation. "Talk to the association. We're just contractors." Before Lucas could respond, the man turned away and barked an order to his partner. They finished unloading the truck in record time and sped off, leaving Lucas fuming in their wake. He glanced at the dumpsters, now overflowing with jagged debris and spilling onto the street. The stench was unbearable, and the pile of trash looked like it could topple at any moment. Back inside, Lucas immediately called Rebecca. "They're escalating," he said, pacing the kitchen. "Two guys just showed up and dumped more garbage into the dumpsters. It's spilling out onto the street now." Rebecca's tone was calm but firm. "Did you get any photos or video of the truck or the men?" "Yes," Lucas replied. "And I'm sending it to you now." "Good," she said. "I'll add this to the complaint. We're already building a strong case, but every new incident helps. I've also reached out to the city's environmental department about the hazardous waste. If those materials are what we suspect, the association is in violation of multiple laws." Lucas felt a flicker of hope, but quickly tamped it down. He couldn't let himself relax, not when Michael Pearson was clearly ramping up his efforts. By noon, the environmental inspector Rebecca had contacted arrived at Lucas's house. He was a serious-looking man in his 50s, wearing a badge that read City Environmental Services. The inspector introduced himself as Mr. Conway and immediately began examining the dumpsters. Lucas walked him through everything: the initial placement of the dumpsters, the chemical smell, the hazardous materials he'd found, and the most recent dumping incident. Conway nodded thoughtfully as Lucas spoke, taking notes on a clipboard and snapping pictures of the containers and the surrounding area. After about 20 minutes, Conway turned to Lucas. "You were right to call us. These dumpsters are a problem not just because of the hazardous waste, but also the way they're overflowing and leaking onto the ground. That's a violation of city regulations, and whoever's responsible for them could face serious fines." Lucas felt a surge of vindication. "So you'll be taking action?" Conway nodded. "I'll be filing a report today. The city will send a formal notice to the association, giving them a deadline to remove the dumpsters and clean up the site. If they don't comply, we'll escalate to legal action." "Thank you," Lucas said, relief washing over him. For the first time in days, it felt like the tide was turning in his favor. That evening, Lucas updated Rebecca on Conway's visit. She was pleased with the progress but cautioned him not to let his guard down. "Pearson isn't the type to give up easily," she warned. "If the city comes down on him, he'll look for other ways to pressure you." Her prediction proved accurate. The next morning, Lucas woke to find his lawn covered in flyers. They were cheap, hastily printed sheets accusing him of being a bad neighbor and claiming that his failure to comply with community standards was harming the entire neighborhood. The flyers were littered with lies, accusations that Lucas's solar panels were an eyesore, that his lawn was overgrown, it wasn't, and that he had refused to contribute to association projects. Emma found one of the flyers stuck to the windshield of Lucas's truck and brought it inside. "Dad, what's this?" she asked, holding it up. Lucas scanned the paper, his anger simmering. "It's Pearson," he said through gritted teeth. "He's trying to turn the neighbors against us." Emma's face fell. "Why is he doing this? We haven't done anything wrong." "Because bullies like him thrive on fear," Lucas said. "He thinks if he makes us look like the bad guys, no one will question him." Lucas spent the rest of the morning collecting the flyers and throwing them away. He noticed that some of his neighbors were peeking out from behind their curtains, clearly aware of the drama unfolding but unwilling to get involved. One neighbor, a woman named Carla, who lived 2 houses down, finally worked up the courage to approach him. "Lucas," she said hesitantly, "I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what's happening. This whole thing is ridiculous. Pearson's been pushing everyone around for years, but no one wants to speak up." Lucas looked at her, sensing both her fear and her frustration. "Carla, if no one speaks up, he's going to keep getting away with this. I can't fight him alone." She hesitated, glancing nervously up and down the street. "I'll think about it," she said finally, before retreating back to her house. Lucas didn't blame her. He knew the kind of pressure Pearson could exert, and not everyone had the resources or the will to fight back. Still, her words fueled his resolve. That evening, Lucas noticed something strange while reviewing his security footage. A black SUV had been parked near his house for most of the day, its tinted windows preventing him from seeing inside. The vehicle hadn't done anything overtly suspicious, but its presence felt deliberate. Lucas sent the footage to Rebecca, who agreed that it was worth investigating. "It could be someone from the association, or it could be Pearson himself," she said. "Either way, keep an eye out. We'll add it to the file if anything else happens." As night fell, Lucas couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He double-checked the locks on his doors and windows, making sure Emma was safe in her room before settling into the living room with his laptop. He had just started compiling more evidence when his phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. "I've got news," the message read. "The city sent their notice to the association this afternoon. Pearson has 48 hours to remove the dumpsters and clean up the site, or they'll face legal action." Lucas exhaled slowly, feeling a glimmer of hope. But as he looked out the window at the dark street beyond, he couldn't help but wonder what Pearson's next move would be. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Lucas woke up the next morning to a deafening noise outside his window, a metallic crash that made the house shudder. He bolted upright, his pulse racing, and rushed to the front door. As he stepped outside, he froze. The dumpsters were still there, but now they were surrounded by heaps of fresh debris. Someone had dumped what looked like smashed concrete slabs and twisted rebar right in the middle of his driveway. The pile was so large that it spilled onto the lawn, crushing the flower bed Emma had planted with care earlier in the spring. He spotted a pair of work gloves lying on top of the rubble, carelessly discarded, as if to mock him. But whoever had done this was long gone. Lucas clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was outright sabotage. Emma appeared behind him, her voice quiet but shaken. "Dad, who would do this?" Lucas turned to her, forcing his anger down for her sake. "Someone who doesn't want us to fight back," he said. "But we're not giving up." He grabbed his phone and began taking pictures of the mess, documenting every angle. The cracked concrete slabs were stained with a rusty, reddish residue, and shards of glass glittered in the morning sunlight. It looked less like construction debris and more like industrial waste, the kind of thing that didn't belong anywhere near a residential neighborhood. Lucas called Rebecca, his voice tight with frustration as he described the scene. "They're trying to overwhelm me," he said. "Every time I make progress, they escalate. Now they've dumped this junk all over my driveway." Rebecca sighed, her tone calm but resolute. "This is good for us, Lucas. It's reckless and desperate, and it shows that whoever is behind this is losing control. I'll add this to the complaint. Did you see who did it? No, Lucas admitted. They must have come overnight. Check your cameras, Rebecca suggested. If we can identify the truck or the people responsible, we can use it as direct evidence. Lucas hung up and immediately went to review the footage. As he fast-forwarded through hours of recording, he finally spotted movement around 2:30 a.m. A large flatbed truck had pulled up in front of his house, its headlights off. 3 figures jumped out wearing dark clothing and masks. They worked quickly, unloading the debris in almost complete silence. The camera caught glimpses of their faces as they turned toward the house, but the masks obscured any identifying features. Lucas froze the footage on the truck's license plate, but his stomach sank when he saw it was covered with tape. These people knew exactly what they were doing. He sent the footage to Rebecca, who responded almost immediately. They're getting bolder, she said. But this actually works in our favor. The more brazen they get, the easier it'll be to prove harassment. I'll forward this to the investigator and see if they can identify the truck based on its make and model. In the meantime, I'm filing for an emergency injunction. If we can get a judge to issue a temporary order, it'll force them to stop all activity while we prepare the case. Lucas nodded, though he knew she couldn't see him. Do it. I'll clean this up in the meantime. As he hung up, Lucas realized the scale of what he was up against. Whoever was doing this wasn't just trying to intimidate him, they were trying to break him. But as he stared at the mess in his driveway, he felt something shift inside him. If they thought he was going to fold under pressure, they didn't know him at all. Lucas spent the next few hours clearing the rubble, enlisting the help of a local waste removal company to haul away the heavier pieces. The bill was steep, but he knew he didn't have a choice. The driveway was unusable in its current state, and the smell from the dumpsters was starting to seep into the house again, despite his best efforts to keep the windows sealed. By the time the driveway was clear, Lucas was exhausted, but his determination hadn't wavered. That evening, as he was finishing dinner with Emma, there was a knock at the door. Lucas opened it to find George, the elderly neighbor who had warned him about Pearson before. George began, glancing nervously over his shoulder. I need to tell you something. But you didn't hear it from me. Lucas gestured for him to come inside, his curiosity piqued. What is it? George hesitated, then leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. Pearson's been meeting with some developer types. I overheard him talking to one of them at the last board meeting. They're trying to buy up the whole neighborhood. The dumpsters, the fines, all the harassment, it's not just about you. They want to drive people out so they can sell the land. Lucas felt a surge of anger and validation. Do you have proof? George shook his head. Just what I've heard. But you're not the first one they've targeted. The Parkers, the Jacksons, even old Mrs. Sullivan, they all left after Pearson started pulling this kind of crap. You're the only one fighting back. Lucas thanked George for the information, but the conversation left him with more questions than answers. If Pearson was working with developers, it explained his aggression, but it also meant Lucas was up against something much bigger than just one man. The next day, Rebecca called with news. The judge granted the injunction, she said. This means they can't escalate any further until the case is heard. If they dump more trash or harass you in any way, they'll be in contempt of court. Lucas felt a wave of relief but knew better than to let his guard down. Pearson had already shown he was willing to ignore rules when it suited him. That evening, as Lucas sat in his living room reviewing his notes, Emma called out from the kitchen. Dad, someone's outside. Lucas bolted to the window, his heart pounding. A black SUV was parked across the street, its headlights off. 2 figures sat inside, their faces just barely visible through the tinted windows. Grabbing his phone, Lucas started recording as he stepped outside. The SUV's engine roared to life, and it sped off down the street before he could get a closer look. Lucas sent the footage to Rebecca, who responded almost immediately. This is getting out of hand, she said. I'll report this to the police, but in the meantime, you need to stay vigilant. If they're sending people to watch your house, they're feeling the pressure. As the SUV disappeared into the night, Lucas stood on his porch, his fists clenched. He wasn't just fighting for his home anymore, he was fighting for every neighbor who had been bullied into submission, for everyone Pearson had pushed out of the community. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lucas had been bracing for escalation, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. Just as he was starting to feel some relief from the court-ordered injunction, the situation took a dangerous turn. He woke up one morning to the acrid smell of smoke and the blaring sound of Emma yelling, "Dad, there's a fire." Rushing outside, Lucas saw thick, black smoke billowing from one of the dumpsters. The flames licked the sides of the container, sending sparks and ash into the air. The fire had spread to the overflowing debris pile next to it, and the heat was so intense that the grass around the driveway had already turned brown. Lucas's instincts kicked in immediately. "Emma, call 911, he shouted, grabbing the garden hose and spraying water at the base of the fire. It wasn't enough to stop the blaze, but it slowed its spread until the fire department arrived minutes later. Firefighters quickly extinguished the flames, but not before the smoke had stained the side of Lucas's house and melted part of the driveway. One of the firefighters approached Lucas, his expression grim. "You're lucky it didn't spread to the house," he said. "These dumpsters shouldn't be anywhere near residential property. What's going on here?" Lucas explained the situation, his frustration boiling over. "The Residents Association put them here to pressure me into paying bogus fees. I've already filed a complaint with the city and have a court order against them, but they're still pushing." The firefighter nodded. "You'll want to report this to the authorities. This wasn't an accident, those dumpsters are a hazard, and someone clearly wanted to send a message." After the fire crew left, Lucas called Rebecca. "This has gone too far," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "They set the dumpsters on fire. My house could have burned down." Rebecca's response was sharp and immediate. "We're escalating this. I'm filing an emergency motion to hold the association in contempt of court. This is a blatant violation of the injunction, and if we can prove intent, Pearson could face criminal charges. Do you have any evidence of who might have done this?" Lucas thought of the black SUV that had been parked outside his house the night before. He reviewed his security footage and found the vehicle idling on the street just hours before the fire started. The footage didn't show the fire being set, but the timing was suspicious enough to raise questions. Rebecca worked quickly, filing the motion and presenting the footage as part of the evidence. The court moved faster than Lucas expected, and within 48 hours, a hearing was scheduled. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation as Lucas sat next to Rebecca at the plaintiff's table. Michael Pearson entered with his lawyer, his usual smug demeanor replaced by a stiff, defensive posture. Rebecca wasted no time. She laid out the timeline of events, from the illegal placement of the dumpsters to the fire that nearly destroyed Lucas's property. She presented the security footage, the fire department's report, and the evidence of environmental violations, tying it all back to Pearson's leadership. "This is not just a case of harassment," Rebecca said, her voice steady but forceful. "This is a deliberate, targeted campaign to intimidate my client and force him into compliance. The association, under Mr. Pearson's direction, has shown a blatant disregard for court orders and public safety." Pearson's lawyer tried to deflect, claiming that the fire was a random act of vandalism unrelated to the association. But Rebecca countered with the footage of the black SUV and evidence linking the truck used to dump debris to a contractor hired by Pearson. When Pearson took the stand, his composure faltered. Under Rebecca's relentless questioning, he admitted that the dumpsters had been placed as part of enforcement efforts, though he denied any involvement in the fire. But the damage was done. His admissions painted a clear picture of a leader abusing his power to bully a homeowner. The turning point came when George, the elderly neighbor, stepped forward to testify. He recounted overhearing Pearson's conversations with developers and detailed how other neighbors had been pushed out through similar tactics. His testimony added weight to the argument that this wasn't just a personal vendetta, it was part of a broader scheme. The judge listened carefully, his expression unreadable, until the final moments of the hearing. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm. "Mr. Pearson, He began, "Your actions as president of the association are not only reprehensible but unlawful. You have violated the injunction issued by this court, endangered public safety, and demonstrated a clear pattern of harassment against Mr. Hunt. The court orders the immediate removal of all dumpsters from Mr. Hunt's property, a cease and desist on any further actions against him, and restitution for damages caused by the fire and debris dumping." Lucas felt a wave of relief wash over him, but the judge wasn't finished. This matter will also be referred to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges, including contempt of court and violations of environmental regulations. It is the court's hope that this serves as a warning to the association and others in positions of authority who might abuse their power. As the gavel struck, Lucas exhaled deeply. He turned to Rebecca, who gave him a satisfied nod. "We did it," she said, her tone calm but triumphant. Pearson left the courtroom quickly, his lawyer trailing behind him, but Lucas didn't care. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe again. The fight wasn't completely over. There were still loose ends to tie up, and he knew Pearson wouldn't go down quietly, but for now, he had won a decisive victory. The dumpsters were gone by the end of the week. Lucas stood at his driveway, watching as a waste removal truck hauled away the last of the rusted containers. The smell of chemicals and decay still lingered faintly in the air, but the sight of his cleared driveway felt like the first real sign of peace in weeks. Emma joined him on the porch, holding 2 mugs of coffee, one for him, one for herself, even though hers was more cream and sugar than anything else. "Think it's really over?" she asked, handing him the mug. Lucas took a sip, the heat of the coffee grounding him. "Not completely," he admitted, "but it's a start. The dumpsters are gone, Pearson's been humiliated in court, and we've got the association on the defensive. For now, that's enough." Emma nodded, her expression softening for the first time in days. "I'm glad." It was starting to feel like they'd never back off. As they went back inside, Lucas reflected on how much had changed since the battle began. He hadn't just fought for his home, he'd fought for his dignity, his family, and the right to live without fear of being bullied. It had been exhausting, but it had also taught him something important: no one could take what you weren't willing to give up. Over the next few days, Lucas worked to restore some sense of normalcy. He repainted the side of the house where the smoke from the fire had stained it, replaced the patches of grass scorched by the heat, and replanted Emma's flower bed with new blooms. The neighbors who had once kept their distance began to approach him, cautiously at first, but with growing warmth. Carla from 2 houses down brought over a tray of cookies as a peace offering. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice tinged with guilt, "for standing up to Pearson. A lot of us were too scared to speak out, but you did, and because of you, things might actually change around here." Lucas accepted the cookies with a smile. It wasn't easy, he said, but someone had to do it, and if things are really going to change, we all have to stay involved. Pearson got away with what he did for so long because no one pushed back. That can't happen again. Carla nodded, looking determined. "You're right. Count me in." The court's decision sent ripples through the community. Pearson was officially removed as president of the Residents Association, and an interim board was appointed to oversee operations until new elections could be held. The city's investigation into the hazardous materials found in the dumpsters led to additional fines for the association, further tarnishing Pearson's already damaged reputation. Lucas also received restitution for the damages caused by the fire and the dumping, though it barely covered the full cost of repairs. Still, it wasn't about the money, it was about principle. Pearson had tried to break him, and he'd failed. One evening, Rebecca called with an update. "The district attorney's office is moving forward with charges against Pearson," she said. "It's going to take time, but it's a step in the right direction." "How are you holding up?" Lucas smiled, glancing out the window at the sunset spilling across his freshly restored lawn. "Better than I have in weeks," he said. "Thanks to you." "Well, you did most of the heavy lifting," Rebecca replied, "but I'm glad we got the result you deserved. Keep me posted if anything else comes up." The weeks turned into months, and the neighborhood began to feel like home again. The new interim board seemed intent on undoing Pearson's damage, holding regular meetings and inviting input from the community. Lucas attended a few, not because he wanted to stay involved in the politics, but because he wanted to make sure the changes stuck. One day, as he was working on his truck in the driveway, George stopped by, leaning on his cane. "You know, Lucas," he said, "this neighborhood owes you more than it probably ever will admit. What you did, it gave people hope. People like me who thought nothing would ever change." Lucas wiped his hands on a rag, feeling a mix of pride and humility. "I just didn't want them to win," he said simply. George chuckled. "Well, you did more than that. You reminded us what it means to stand up for what's right. Don't forget that." As George walked away, Lucas stood there for a moment, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The air was quiet, free of the stench and chaos that had defined his life for so long. For the first time in months, Lucas felt like he could breathe again. But as he turned to go back inside, something caught his eye, a small envelope sticking out of his mailbox. He pulled it out, his stomach tightening as he read the single line scrawled on the back in sharp, jagged handwriting. "This isn't over." Lucas stared at the note for a long moment before folding it carefully and slipping it into his pocket. He didn't know who had sent it or what they meant by it, but one thing was clear: if the fight wasn't over, neither was he.